The barbed wire is endless. I've never not seen barbed wire. There is only one way in, no way out. The thought of him hangs over the village like a cloud. His word is law. His words are the words of God, the Almighty. We must work hard and reap what we sow on God's earth. We mustn't love anyone but Him. We mustn't think. For we are the chosen ones, and He our chosen leader. Disobedience is punished. It's our own fault. He makes us confess our sins in front of everyone. The beatings are to cleanse us of the darkness. Then there's the room with a single stretcher where He lets lightning rods dart through your stripped body. They have been everywhere. I've only been in there once. Not even the tablets the doctor gives us could make me forget that pain. And they make me forget most other things. Fest days were always my favourite. All the dancing and the laughter. I could stand near the woman who I think is my mother, although who could be sure? The aunts won't say, and we mustn't ask. But there's something familiar in her gaze. Only on fest days. Only on fest days could I glance at you. On other days I had to fear him, and his eyes and ears everywhere. On fest days he was preoccupied with making sure our guests received the warmest Bavarian welcome. Once my glance lingered on your face, my dear, perhaps just a little too long. It was the last fest when we played the fiddles and danced and sang for the general and his junta. We wore our best dresses. We'd baked all night, and I remember bursting with excitement awaiting dawn. When I caught your eye and you smiled back at me, I knew I would be fine for the months until the next time. But he saw it too. Or did someone tell him? I knew it as soon as I was in confession the next morning. The way he smiled when he asked what else was on my mind. All I remember before everything went dark was his voice, his angelic voice, ordering them to cleanse me of my sins. Then I went numb. First my stomach, then my legs, and then my heart, and the leather boots kept coming over and over again. I couldn't go back to work on the field for 2 weeks. May the Lord forgive me. This is a story about oppression, perseverance, and survival. About people at their most evil and at their absolute limits. It's about manipulation and abuse, about the systematic dissolution of morals, affection, and free will, all in the name of the Lord. Criminal dealings involving high-ranking politicians and the crossing of national borders, lies, intrigue, and deception, en masse. Sounds like a great new Netflix show you'd binge watch? It's a real story. One so evil, otherworldly, and outright unbelievable, Joe Nesbo couldn't have written it better. This is the story of La Colonia Dignidad. We're in Chile in 1961, although this is technically not where the story begins. It's the height of the Cold War, and the CIA under Kennedy has begun to carefully form connections with some of the key Chilean political figures to avoid a repeat of their Cuban disaster. A move which arguably set the course for the 17-year-long military dictatorship Chile would be submitted to just over a decade later. Away from the political scene for now, about 200 miles south of the capital, Santiago de Chile, is the Mole region, which, if you believe Google, is among the most beautiful parts of the country. A famed wine region dotted with waterfalls, rock formations, and natural pools, bordered by the Pacific Ocean to the west and the Andes to the east. However, I'm not interested in this part of Chile for its unique countryside. The story I've been hearing about since I was a young girl is set right here, at the foot of the Andes, not too far from the regional capital Talca, where, so legend has it, the Declaration of Independence from the Spanish was signed in 1818. In the middle of nowhere, an area of roughly 50 square miles stands out against the untouched countryside. It is surrounded by thousands of meters of barbed wire fence, which unapologetically cuts through the peaceful countryside. There is one gate, and the sign above it reads Colonia Dignidad, which can be loosely translated to Charity Dignity. The official name was La Sociedad Benefactora y Educacional Dignidad, the Charitable and Educational Society Dignity. The name you may find familiar is Colonia Dignidad, the Dignity Colony. With such an innocent name welded in metal above the entrance, an unimaginable story begins, one that will bring us all the way back to present day. From 1961 on, a group of German settlers lived here under the strict rule of one man and a handful of his chosen helpers. Complete isolation, brainwashing, slave-like working conditions, flogging, and systematic sexual abuse defined their days. It's a dark chapter in German as well as Chilean history, for reasons you'll come to understand. And having happened such a long time ago, a chapter that remains unresolved. The sinister developments, leading all the way up to the bizarre situation today, made me wonder if, once the thick layers of violence, abuse, accountability and retribution are peeled back, there is also a story about forgiveness to be found. Let's keep this in mind as I walk you through the history. The story really begins in Germany in the 1950s, with Paul Schäfer. Schäfer was born on December 4th, 1921, in Siegburg, Germany, and served as a paramedic during World War II. He'd had a glass eye since childhood, which made him unfit for military service. After the war, he became a youth worker in a Protestant community church, although he was asked to leave after a couple of years when rumors of sexual misconduct concerning young boys were growing. He then toured the Rhineland region as a lay preacher, proclaiming the Apostolic Age, a form of Christianity. In nearby Gronau, he settled and founded the Private Soziale Mission, an evangelical free church community. Described as a charismatic preacher, he'd soon garnered an impressive following, but it wasn't long before new sexual abuse accusations came up, and Schäfer decided to simply move his whole mission abroad. Their destination was Chile, and although it is unclear why exactly he chose this country, I'm guessing 3 reasons. Firstly, Latin America had in previous years been a successful choice of exile for high-ranking German war criminals. Going into hiding was usually facilitated by populist right-wing political climates. Secondly, the region of Chile he chose had just suffered one of the worst earthquakes in history, so missionary work abroad to help the local population would not be a hard sell. And lastly, Schäfer had been preaching about the looming Cold War and an imminent communist takeover. Thus he managed to convince entire families, as well as unaccompanied children, to join him in a new world where they would spread God's work and goodwill to those in need, away from political dangers. In the untouched countryside of Parral, about 200 miles south of the capital Santiago de Chile, the group found their new home, which soon turned into what looked like an idyllic German village on the outside. Traditional garments, braided hair, flags, and rye bread from their own bakery. The locals welcomed the Germans who were so eager to help, building a free hospital and a school, providing doctors, medicine, and education for everyone in the area. For the residents, however, it was an entirely different story. Children and parents lived separated. No show of affection was tolerated. Instead of parents, all children had aunts who raised them in groups of about 10, a community effort in the colony. Men and women lived and worked separately, no contact was permitted, except being in the same room during worship and special meetings. They worked 16 to 18-hour days in the surrounding fields, in the washrooms, the bakery or the kitchen, without salary. Work and worship were the only 2 important aspects of life, according to their leader. Schäfer had molded his own personal fundamentalist religion, with himself as a messianic leader figure at the center. Every resident had to confess their thoughts and feelings to him, daily, through a carefully crafted system of control, isolation, espionage and punishment, and by railing against the corruption outside the colony's gates, he managed to control every move and thought of hundreds of his followers. What would only much later become known through witness reports was that Schäfer had fostered a culture of extreme abuse, both physical and mental. This included public humiliation, flogging, electroshocks, and the use of psychotic drugs at any sign of resistance or dissent. He had created a bubble where no one trusted anyone, where every step and every word out of line had painful consequences, where banishment into the supposed apocalyptic outside world was a real threat, where love, affection, marriage, and any type of body contact was forbidden, unless Schäfer granted it, which he rarely did. School books were censored and readings from the Bible were carefully chosen to reinforce this way of life. With every relationship clouded by a veil of suspicion and fear, normal life was shattered. Torture became the routine, a brutal exercise of power, sometimes carried to the brink of death. You might have had a hunch already that those sexual abuse rumors weren't unfounded. In fact, they were entirely true. And with Colonia Dignidad, Schäfer had created an ideal environment to feed his sadistic needs. Thousands of boys were sexually abused in the colony. They would have to undress before him, and then take showers together. If he particularly favoured someone, they'd become his personal runner for chores and errands. He would also make them share his bed. Once they reached the age of about 17, they got too old and he would select a new boy. His carefully crafted system of isolation had one fairly obvious flaw. There was no offspring, no new generation. When this became a problem for Schäfer, he decided to open the gates to the locals. This is where several Chilean families become entangled in this story. Back home in Germany, for a very long time, the government felt highly sympathetic towards the settlement. Especially politicians from the Christian Social Union, or CSU, considered the Colonia to be a German idyll abroad, where traditional values were safe from the dangers of the rebellious generation of '68. The conservatism, the reminiscence of Bavaria, the pride in the flag of line and lozenges, a hope for Germany. High-ranking politicians such as Franz Josef Strauss were regular guests, though they would have seen a different side to the colony. Parades and feasts would be rolled out for guests, festivities, displays of songs and dance, an airtight, happy German facade. The German embassy in Santiago also held close contact with Schäfer. The deception, violence, brutality and abuse were perhaps outside the realm of the imaginable at the time, and did not allow anyone to see beyond the front of choirs, perfect braids, and Black Forest gateau. In 1973, the political climate in Chile turned extremely favorable for Schäfer. General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende by coup and established a military regime. This is where Chile's political elite joins the story. Pinochet immediately understood the possibilities and advantages of the Colonia. His secret police, the Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional, or DINA, began using the cellars of the isolated settlement as a political prison, and it wasn't long until the first dissidents arrived. Some never left. An estimated 350 government opponents and left-wing activists have gone missing here during Pinochet's rule. Organizations like the AMCD, which stands for La Asociación por la Memoria y los Derechos Humanos Colonia Dignidad, and translates to the Association for the Memory and Human Rights Colonia Dignidad, are fighting for the solving of countless cases of disappearances linked to the German settlement. So while terror let the numbers of bodies and disappearances grow outside of the barbed wire fence, it fueled shame, obedience, and silence inside the colony. In Latin America, strongman rulers such as Pinochet have a long and established history. They're called caudillos, lone wolf politicians and talented public speakers, powerful, sovereign, often dictatorial and extremely well-connected. The ultimate patriarch, though too egocentric to be preoccupied with siring a line of succession. A messianic figure at the center of the state, protecting, leading, and suffering for his people. but also eradicating any sign of dissidence and opposition, for the greater good. Schäfer received protection in return for providing weapons and a secret torture prison to Pinochet. One ruled a country, the other ruled a microstate within a state. Could we perhaps consider Paul Schäfer the German counterpart to Augusto Pinochet? Was this a rare, symbiotic, and therefore tolerated relationship between two caudillos in the same country? In 1984, Schäfer's perfect facade slowly began to crumble, as two families managed to flee and report back in Germany what was happening in La Colonia. There had been attempts before, of course, but after seeking help at the German embassy in Chile, escapees were repeatedly sent back and would not try it again. These reports led the German government to officially denounce any links to the colony, although financing continued. Schäfer had been receiving pension payments for him and his followers, as well as financial aid from a government fund for development work abroad, a considerable sum over the years. General Pinochet stepped down in 1990 after a plebiscite. And then in 1991, the democratically elected new president, Patricio Aylwin, officially dissolved the Colonia Dignidad, taking away its charitable status for its part during the dictatorship. It will take until 1995 for the police and law officials to start their official investigation into the leadership of the colony. And soon after, a number of Chilean parents filed the first lawsuit against Paul Schäfer for sexual abuse. At the time, the colony's doctor, Hartmut Hopp, deals with the police. Hopp is another puzzle in this unique story. He followed Schäfer as a 17-year-old to Chile. A favorite of his, he was allowed to study medicine in the US in his 20s. After experiencing the outside world, he only returned on the promise of being allowed to marry the love of his life, an extremely rare exception. In 1977, he marries Dorothea Wittan in the colony. They still live together in Germany today. More on that later. As the village doctor, he ran the hospital that provided much-needed healthcare for the locals. Behind closed doors, however, this was also where disobedient residents were nursed back to health after receiving beatings and electroshocks. High dosages of Meloril were regularly administered here, a tranquilizer used for treatment of schizophrenia. Hopp was found guilty on most of these charges and sentenced to prison in Chile in 2011, but he managed to flee to Germany before being apprehended. Because Germany's laws do not allow for extradition, he has been living in Krefeld with his wife, Dorothea, ever since. Lawyers have been working on building a case against him on the grounds of national law, which would effectively be the first conviction under German law for what's happened at the Colonia Dignidad. In the mid-90s, as the news began to tighten, Schäfer fled to Argentina, where he's not caught until 2005. Despite the long list of abhorrent crimes spanning over decades, the Chilean court found him guilty of the following: 20 counts of dishonest abuse and 5 counts of child rape in the period of 1993 to 1997. He was sentenced to 33 years. In 2010, at the age of 84, he died in prison in Chile from a heart failure. A number of Schäfer's trusted friends returned to Germany, and so did several former victims, and most of them to the same town, Krefeld. The reason for that is Ewald Frank. Frank runs a church in Krefeld called Freie Volksmission, or Free People's Mission, and his beliefs are not dissimilar to Schäfer's, albeit less misanthropic. A dualistic worldview of black and white, of God on one side and the devil on the other. It was a familiar environment for the returned, whose lives had stood still in time for decades, while the world around them had moved on at double speed. How can abuser and abused live in the same community and worship at the same church without justice having been served, or in fact having been evaded? Some say that God will be their judge. Others see them as victims of the system too. Religion, in this case, became both an extreme trauma and a means of coping. Is it then possible to move on with life if those who committed crimes walk freely amongst everyone else, maybe even live next door? Could we maybe borrow Hannah Arendt's theories on the banality of evil to gain a better understanding of this? Through empathy, Arendt's concept of the banality of evil may facilitate some form of forgiveness. If we can see perpetrators as unthinking rather than pure evil, forgiveness and moving on might become a possibility when trying to understand their reason for being complicit, whether it was out of conviction, enjoyment, or having been victimized themselves. While, and this would be in accordance with Arendt, this cannot be applied to Schäfer himself. It may be useful in the case of the likes of Hartmut Hopp. So why is this story still relevant today, if the leader of the sect is long dead and gone? Well, La Colonia Dignidad is still open, albeit under a different name, Villa Baviera. Since 2009 it has been operating as a tourist destination, complete with hotel, pool and playground, after the remaining residents took a vote on their future. The name was changed soon after Schäfer fled, and depending on what side of the fence you're on with this story, the renaming of Colonia Dignidad can mean different things. On the one hand, residents still living there have a chance to move on and leave the past behind. Begin again, without having to do so in a judgmental world that has, unbeknownst to them, developed for 30 years. On the other hand, it could be seen as an evasion of the law, an attempt to cover up and safeguard assets. Regime victims and their families simply consider it a disrespectful, tasteless attempt at amnesia. Hans Schreiber and Anna Schnellenkamp are amongst those running the Villa today. Both are children of former residents, born in the colony, with their parents either imprisoned for crimes of complicity or deceased. The website of the Villa Baviera promises una auténtica villa alemana para encantar los sentidos, an authentic German villa to enchant the senses. Anna was at the helm of turning Colonia Dignidad into a tourist destination. It was an attempt of survival for the remaining residents, to take the burden of the past from their shoulders and move on. Most of the residents are over 65 years old. They know nothing apart from these 50 square miles in central Chile. Many feel like emotional cripples, and most are physically impaired. If it's all you've known for your entire life, and you don't speak the language of the country you live in, you have no money, no papers, and are emotionally and physically scarred from years of abuse and isolation, would you leave? So, many stayed, working on the land and continuing to be proud of their German heritage. All former Colonia residents, both victims and abusers, share a history that chains them together for life. At least internally, many remain unfree. In a twisted way, they were made to feel extremely special under Schäfer's rule. After the collapse of the Colonia, not only did they lose their leader and were suddenly catapulted into a completely unfamiliar time, but they also would have realized that the whole world had an entirely different opinion of them. The realization that inhumane crimes had been committed at the colony, and that the positive image of the self was perhaps exactly the opposite to the rest of the world, would cause most to have an existential crisis at best. Some residents consider their abusers victims too, and see the fault with the German government who failed to act for decades, despite having had evidence of the Pinochet regime using the Colonia as a torture prison as early as 1977. As little a gesture as acknowledgement from an official side would help to bring a bit of closure. Others still recall the shock of discovering that Schäfer, a man they had idolized and confessed their most intimate thoughts to for decades, had been so villainous. Again, others are convinced that the accusations of torture of dissidents are fictitious attempts to further attack the Colonia by the leftist government that succeeded Pinochet. A severe case of repression, perhaps due to years of brainwashing. A coping mechanism to not lose everything your life consisted of at once. Positive re-evaluation has been proven to occur in victims of extreme trauma as a means of coping, to not break apart on the inside. Views such as, "Not everything that happened here was bad," or "Schäfer did lead me to God," were very common. While the process of working through the German side of the history has been slow on the part of the government, There have been some attempts in the previous years. 2016 saw a state visit by the then federal president Joachim Gauck to Chile. What should have been a clear statement by the Foreign Office to work with the Chilean government in order to help shed light onto the mutual history and perhaps bring some justice, or at least a degree of closure for the victims, turned into a national scandal. Besides victims and their families, the Foreign Office had also invited Reinhard Zeitner to the event at the embassy. At the Colonia, Zeitner had been a security guard under Schäfer. Alongside Hartmut Hopp, he had been sentenced to 3 years in prison on probation for sexual abuse of a child in the early 2000s, and is rumoured to still hold a management position within Villa Baviera today. So how do you deal with being a victim and being an abuser? How is guilt processed after years of silence and ignorance, especially if the previous abusive leadership still holds a position of power? Under normal circumstances, the guilty would confess and receive whatever punishment appropriate for their crimes. But it's become apparent in this case that the guilty have not been treated as such, or in fact, are victims of abuse as well. However, without working through the past, there can't be a future, and without some degree of forgiveness, there can't be a working through the past. And according to Arendt, forgiveness requires crimes to be known and named. The current website of the Villa Baviera states, and this is a loose translation, that the residents are owners of their freedom. They are men and women who could rebuild their lives and rebuild themselves from the pain, the knowledge of the truth and the public judgment that their self-proclaimed leader received until the day of his death. Free to start over, free to live again. So, why not turn the grounds into a memorial site? Continuing to attract visitors under a similar premise as the Colonia Dignidad once did would seem counterproductive with regards to a healing process. If commemoration and a willingness to talk about the past is not granted or facilitated, then honouring the memory and beginning the process of forgiveness or moving on seems increasingly unlikely. Remembering is a complex and notoriously frail process. This is partly because memory is not an exclusively individual act. Not only what we remember, but the way we remember it is influenced by social circumstances and constructed worldviews, as well as by personal needs and perspective. A memorial could be the basis of the shared memory, allowing victims to commemorate and perhaps put even the most painful memories behind them, as well as help the country heal from those invisible wounds the military dictatorship inflicted. There is also something particularly German about the phenomenon of Colonia Dignidad, a romanticized rhapsody, a religious idealism that went too far and sank into the abyss of horror, torture, and murder. The fantasy of the pure, the dutifulness, order, work, and obedience. In the face of such gruesome acts, psychological attempts of understanding quickly come to their limits, so perhaps we should accept various ways of processing. The release of a major motion picture called Colonia Dignidad in 2016 has rekindled the debate in the German parliament. At a screening at the German embassy, the then German Minister for Foreign Affairs, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, held one of the perhaps most self-critical speeches yet with regards to any government responsibility. This illustrates how it sometimes takes an artistic impetus to help begin dealing with difficult political situations and real-life human tragedies. The film, starring Emma Watson, acted as a cultural commentator and a trigger for politics, which, coincidentally, is a tradition that politicians in Latin America have long honoured. In April 2016, the Chilean government declared the extensive Colonia archive a national heritage. The documents depicting the torture and abuse that took place within the settlement are considered an important part of the investigation into the crimes of the Chilean military dictatorship. Activists of the AMCDs celebrated this as a milestone. Protecting and preserving the documents will undoubtedly open doors towards truth, justice and remembrance of crimes against humanity committed by both Colonia Dignidad and the Pinochet regime. And only this year, in 2017, more than 20 years after the beginning of the end of the Colonia Dignidad, has the Chilean High Court ruled, in last instance, that the Villa Baviera, previously Colonia Dignidad, must pay 1.5 million euros in compensation to a group of Chilean residents who had suffered sexual abuse in the early 90s. The case had been ongoing since 2013, but Villa Baviera's board of directors had been fighting the sentence until now. Reconciliation is not possible if impunity prevails, and political reconciliation must include justice as a prerequisite. Everyone who came into contact with La Colonia Dignidad shares a history, a memory. For the time period concerning Chile's military dictatorship, 1973 to 1990, the concept of memory is associated to the political repression that unfolded in the country, with its ubiquitous violations of human rights and deathly resistance to that political oppression. The land where not all unmarked graves have been found to date is used as a tourism destination. For the Chilean victims and their families, their pain and suffering is being disrespected every day that the Villa Baviera stays open. The residents who decided to stay seem to have done so predominantly out of lack of choice and support, with some of the convicted abusers still living next door to them. Roughly 100 previous residents have returned to Germany, and most of them don't want to talk about the Colonia anymore. The few who do or can are suing the German government for compensation, so far unsuccessfully. For the survivors, working through their collective trauma has only just begun. Exhibitions, memorials, annual marches, and popular culture contributions, such as the 2016 film, have helped to acknowledge and record the past. However, both German and Chilean governments, as well as their respective judicial systems, still have a long way to go to ensure some form of reconciliation will be served. Not until all atrocities are recorded, responsibilities assumed, and victims helped, will they be able to put this chapter behind them. Forgiveness might not be possible until then. P.S. This is a complex story spanning over several decades and countries, extremely multifaceted, morally challenging, and historically complicated. Perhaps too complicated to be dealt with all at once. But it's a part of history that should be talked about and not forgotten, today more than ever. Even though I am an uninvolved third-party researcher, as a German, I feel that this is also part of my history. My way of acknowledging this is to tell the story, and, along the way, discover some answers for myself, perhaps. Answers about how to find a way to deal with the still very real aftermath of state violence, terror, oppression, violence of human rights, and survival of abuse. Granted, this may only be the beginning, but it has to start somewhere, right? Thanks for listening to this podcast. If you have any thoughts on what you've just heard, or want to discuss any of the topics involved, you can get in touch by email at rememberingcoloniadignidad@gmail.com. That's remembering, COLONIADIGNIDAD @gmail.com. In the meantime, fdcl.org is a great site for keeping up to date with the ongoing lawsuits, victim support, and any new developments in this story.